about sword fighting. Whoops, thank you, Amy. I don't think we can talk about Cyrano without talking about sword fighting and stage combat, which figure so heavily in Cyrano. So I would love to start by talking with you, Steve.
Sure.
If you can tell us a little bit about how you met Michael back in 1975. You were here in San Francisco at ACT.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was an
experience?
actor in the company, and I was also the combat master there with teaching the students and doing all the fights. And I was very young at that time. There were not a lot of fight directors in the United States, and I had been a fencer. So I adjusted what I knew from when you wear a helmet to you don't wear a helmet, and you have all these safety concerns. It was the last performance of Cyrano de Bergerac for the 1975 season, and we were going to Hawaii the next day. When I got back, the company manager called me in and said, this guy from the San Francisco Ballet, Michael Smuin, wants to meet you. He wants fencing lessons. I said, the ballet? Oh, okay. You know, I didn't know much about the ballet. I thought we were going to meet for quiche or something. And he said, let's go get a hot dog. So we went, we got a hot dog and we were talking, and he said, I loved what you did in the show. I want my dancers to be able to do that. I said, okay. So I started giving him, you know, teaching him how to use this in stage combat, teaching him the strategies that come from dueling into competitive fencing and now into stage combat. And one day he looked at me and said, why don't you just stage the fights with me for the company? So I began a 6-month journey with the dancers. And that the summer of '75, the ballet had no money. We were rehearsing all over the place. We rehearsed in a basement of a church opposite San Francisco State. We put the swords in the trunk of my car and we rode around town. And then of course it opened in 1976 and it was a big hit. So we met at Cyrano. So it's kind of appropriate that we come to Cyrano as one of our, it wasn't our last project, but we come kind of full circle with it. And he wanted all the company dancers to be able to use the sword, women, men, everybody. Cel fought, she was great. Amy fought, Amy was actually she was our fight captain. And then of course, Greg was amazing as Cyrano. And so Michael and I talked and we decided to let, we do a double sword fight. That's where a participant has 2 swords, which is kind of the ultimate in stage combat because it's yin yang, you're constantly moving both sides of the body.
Right. Well, that was an incredible, I'd love to talk more about that a little bit later, but I've been receiving emails about how dangerous and realistic some of the sword fights look in Cyrano. And I'm just wondering if you can share with our audience the process that you undertake when a company learns fencing. I've been talking with Amy and Greg about our days in Cyrano and the hours and hours and hours of fencing lessons that we had, and the focus that you demanded. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yes, the first thing I teach people is how to defend themselves, to go through all the basic parries with the sword, because you have to be able to defend yourself. You know, now these are simulated fights. The targeting is off the body. You probably can't tell it if you watch the ballet, but the sword is about 3 inches off of the real target. So you're adjusting the target from the head. This would be, you know, an attack at the heart, to that. So the real, and this is stage simulation, right? You must aim. Aiming is very important. This is not a generalized thing. You can't just go, well, I'll throw the sword out there and maybe you'll block it. No, you have to be precise. You have to aim. And the sword has to match the music. Now, this is what Michael was so good about, because he'd tell me musically where it had to go and I'd tell him how the sword got there. So, you know, we were always doing this entirely together. But the fencers start very slow, almost at a Tai Chi speed. And then as they gain confidence, then they start to put the acting in. What's the intention of this move? What's the intention of the defense? So that each move has some kind of reality base to it. But our little secrets, we don't want the audience to see how we pull the rabbit out of the hat. We want the audience to be excited. Is it dangerous? Well, yeah. I mean, all activity on the stage is dangerous. And as soon as you're doing anything that's simulated, it's dangerous. And my two favorite sports are football and ballet. And I'll tell you right now, they both have danger. You know, I've seen ballerinas in a rehearsal hit the deck harder than you see the 49ers hit the turf every now and then. So, you know, that's just part of the job, and we accept that. And my job is to try to make it safe for them. I don't think we had any injuries during this show. We might have had a few scraped knuckles here and there. That kind of happens. But it is my job to make sure that the sword tip, this, by the way, it is an abated tip if you look at it. You see how it's turned back? These tips are not sharp. Of course, if you get hit with this, it hurts, but it probably won't cut you as deeply as a point will. You know, this is a simulation of the rapier. Actually, this is sort of like a 57 Chevy. This is what we call the Juliet. We started with this sword when we did Romeo and Juliet. It's an épée blade and a saber guard. And then you have this little, this is if you see the pommel, that's a period pommel. So we took parts from a lot of different things. Why? Because this is light, it weighs a pound. The dancers can jump with it. Because you have an aluminum bell, you have something that's very light. And so the blade, they can easily carry it in the hand. They can extend it and find good definition with it. Definition is something that we say constantly when you're doing a sword fight. The definition is the point going off the body and the receiver coming over and accepting that engagement.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. Amy, I would love to ask you what you remember being fight captain. And obviously you were and continue to be an amazing a person of great detail, which was required. But can you tell us about being the fight captain, as well as being in the ballet and the safety protocols that we undertook before each performance, and what all of that involved? I think it was maybe a precursor to being a ballet master, because didn't you have to learn all the fights? Just like now you have to learn all the steps to the ballet.
I did. It was interesting because I would never have thought of myself as fencing as something. I wasn't, don't think of myself as particularly athletic in that way, but it made sense to me. Steve taught us very meticulously, and it made sense in my brain, similarly to the way ballet does. There's the basic shapes of the parries, and you're precise with those. And then the Steve taught us the different offensive lines of attack, and we started slowly and picked up speed. And so we started. So my job was eventually, once we did that, Michael and Steve asked me if I would be the fight captain, so that once Steve was no longer with us, that I would try to maintain the integrity and the precision of the fight, so they didn't start to erode and they stayed safe and kept everybody focused. So we start with a circle and we tap our sword on the floor. It probably has a name, Steve. You can jump in here and just like get everybody tuned in and focused. And we went through a regimen of the different parries, and just, because it's easy to start twisting your wrist or doing something funny, and just having one of the things Steve said that stuck with me is that the sword was the extension of your limb. And so you did everything with the whole limb, you can't see me, with the whole limb, your whole arm, rather than getting it into the wrists, which a lot of the ladies would start doing that. And then it's not going to where we're directing it. So directing it with the whole arm. So I learned all of the fights. I covered both Greg and Charles. So that was kind of fun. I felt pretty, am I allowed to swear? Felt pretty badass doing the double sword fight. And I learned the Greg part and would practice it with Charles. And then I learned the Charles part and would practice it with Greg a little bit. And I remember calling my brothers, I have 4 brothers, and telling them that I was both throwing and catching a sword on stage, and they didn't believe me. I think Greg killed me 7 or 8 times in that final battle. But it felt like really rewarding and, powerful to be able to go out and accomplish something I never thought I would never have thought would suit me, but it happened to, and it was a great experience to be able to do that through dance.
Can you talk about the process before every single show? I mean, that part of that being the fight captain, what that involved.
Yeah, so before every show, we would make the circle, we'd get organized, we get focused so that everybody's present there in the moment. We would go through the shapes, we would slow motion through some of the fight sequences, going at a slower tempo and then building speed to just make sure the precision was there and nothing was creeping in that would start to degrade the precision and make it unsafe. There was a lot of rhythm to the fight, so we just slow them down, and then so that the first time you're doing it in a day isn't full tempo with adrenaline on stage, sweaty, but you've done it in a calm, organized manner to get your head wrapped around it before the show began.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate you emphasizing that, because normally when we learn choreography, dancing choreography, as an individual, or you might grab your partner and review some things, or you may say, I know all my choreography, I'm just going to go. People have different needs before a show as far as reviewing their choreography. But this was something that was so important because of how Steve emphasized the safety of these fights. We would have everybody come to the stage earlier to allow time for this, so that everybody kind of had to get in the zone and be totally focused so that we would not have an injury. And so that was really Amy's job, to get all of her peers together and say, all right, come on, we're going to review all of these fights right before the stage, especially those very, very difficult ones. Thanks for clarifying that, Amy. But Greg, I would love to talk to you. You had some incredible, incredible fights, especially as Steve mentioned, and you were mentioning, the double sword fights. When we're on stage and we're really trying to get into character, I mean, there were times when I felt Charles was looking pretty much like the villain there, and we kind of had to remind him, this is still make believe. How was that for you, preparing for those fights specifically, and what were your recollections as far as learning then how to use the double sword in combat?
Well, first of all, just like in partnering, there's nothing more important than trust. And my partner in crime, Charles Torres, the one I battled again and again and again, was not only my equal, but I learned from him and he learned from me. His intense glare was his intense focus. And like Steve mentioned, it's offense and defense. And if Charles could do my part, or I could flip around and do Charles' part. So it made it, you knew what was coming and you knew how to defend it, and he knew when I was attacking. Extremely important was trust, and I absolutely trusted Charles Torres, with my life. And in that sense, it lets you go right to the edge, right? If I didn't have that sense of complete trust, that I know Charles is never going to hit me, and I'm never going to hit, things happen on stage, and that's what Steve prepares us for, and that's what Amy prepared us for. And like Amy said, before every show, before every single curtain, Charles and I did every single fight, every single parry, every single lunge, marked it, meaning just go through the shapes and the forms, and then almost full out. And then by the time we did it, Steve had us so rehearsed and so practiced. It was like, a Viennese waltzer asking them to waltz. It seemed like it was in our blood. And Amy really with precision went again over and over and over again. And it is after watching it now, it was like, oh my goodness, that was some serious choreography that Steve and Michael came up with. And it was exciting to me to watch. I had forgotten how intense it was. And Charles Torres, my God, just what a masterful fencer he was. He helped me be better, and I think I helped him. You
were terrific together. I mean, it was wonderful casting. You were a beautiful, and what's the main word about Cyrano is panache, and there you had it. Always. There you go. Well, let's segue to my next question, because I wanted to talk to Steve also about how you go about choreographing the fights. In the ballet, sometimes there's music. And so I can understand what you were saying when Michael said the blade needs to arrive at this time. And so how do we get there? Anticipating, working back in a way. But then the dancers have also the music to help them to stay with the timing of the fight. How do you manage theater fighting? And then in some of our scenes with the storm, you were just hearing sounds of the storm and the wind and the thunder. How do you teach those fights, and how do you keep the tempo when there's not music? So how do you go about that process, whether there is or is not music?
Well, the fight has to tell a story. It can't just be a lot of pretty moves. It has to go somewhere and enhance the entire story of what you're trying to tell, the play, the ballet, the movie, the opera. It is a moment where the people act out. So, that has to come from, in the theater, we call it has to come from given circumstances. In other words, what's going on in the scene, what's the conflict, and from the character. Greg and Charles, I tried to make them slightly different as fencers. I don't know if it really reads. You always try to do that when you have a Tybalt and a Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. They have a slightly different fencing style. Now that comes from the play, because you can read Act 2, Scene 2 in Romeo and Juliet, and Mercutio talks about what kind of fencer Tybalt is. So that makes it easy for me. In Cyrano, Cyrano is a master fencer. So almost any move I put in can work. He's so good with the sword. He can do things behind his back. He has great elan with the weapon. So that's the first thing I begin with. Now I'm like a designer. I'm not like a designer like Sandra, but I am a designer in the sense that I work with a director, and the director gives me what they think these moments should be, where it's coming from in the play, where these people are, and how they would approach each other. And sometimes it's just, a very, very simple kind of statement. I just, before the pandemic, I did Burn This on Broadway with Adam Driver. Michael Mayer, the director, there's a big fight in the play. And I said, Michael, what do you want it to be? And he said, I want it to be Greek. Okay, what does that mean? But if you look at the Greek shapes on vases and things like that, there are these big gestures and there are these big things. So I said, well, that's what he wants. He wants big sweeping gestures. Michael was always very good about telling what he wanted. He was really good with story points. And that's what you have to go for in a fight. You have to make story points. Once that's determined, I start with the actors or the dancers. And if you decide who has the first move, all the rest follows. Because if that is a thrust, or if you're cutting with a point, does the person block it? Does he evade it? Or is it a redouble? I cut for you with the point and then I try to stab you with the point. So that is the beginning, and it all goes from there. And there should be various story points within the work. For example, is one person disarmed? Does one person take the bell and hit the other person in the face? Those are story points. So that's what you begin to build. Now, I believe it was Amy that mentioned, or maybe it was Greg, that we start very slowly. I have the fencers almost go at a Tai Chi speed, at flow. Once they feel like they have the action points, the defensive points, the offensive points, then I say, now you act it, put in the acting. And then it goes from there. And we look at it and we give each other notes. But the main thing is we do it 100 times. That was Michael's expression, by the way. I know a lot of you heard it. He would say, okay, let's do it 100 times. And I've adopted that phrase and I use it all the time in my teaching. It's really important. I teach at NYU at the graduate acting program, and I also teach here at Stella Adler, where I have an office, the Stella Adler Studio of Acting. And, this generation doesn't want to do it 100 times. They want to do it 10 times and then put it on book face and all that stuff. You know, they want to do that, but you do it 100 times. And that's what we believed. And the Smuin company did that. You know, Amy and Greg both remember that we did it over and over and over. You remember, Sal?
Absolutely. It's the repetition. I know Michael in rehearsal would always say, even in choreography, one more time and then we'll go on. One more time and then we'll go on. We wanted to get shirts that said on the front, one more time and on the back, and then we'll go on. Because Michael used to say when you danced a solo, if you can do it 3 times in a row in the studio, you'll have the endurance to do it 1 time straight through on the stage when there's an audience and you have that added pressure. So certainly with the safety involved in these fights, that was required. Well, you mentioned our fabulous costume designer, Sandra, and Sandra, we really must bring you into this conversation because without your beautiful creations, one of many that you made for Michael, and you also have worked literally all over the world, designing costumes. What is your process? Where do you start in designing a ballet? I mean, clearly, if a ballet is set in a certain historic period and the choreographer is intending to go with that same era, that's a place to start. But what else do you have to think about, and what becomes part of your research?
Thank you, Sal. It's yes, the start is very important, and the idea of the period. I think it's really challenging to do period garments for ballet dancers, but over the years, I've tried to really distill out what works for me, and what doesn't. And I mean, for me, visually, when I'm watching you dance, and of course, part of that is that you all have the chance to do a brilliant performance, and I'm not getting in the way. But I don't really want to generalize the costume so much that it doesn't have the flavor of the period. Of course, if it's a modern piece and that's what the choreographer wants, like Steve says, a choreographer, you know, we start there. But if it's supposed to be a period piece, then I think it's important to discover some technique that will allow the reflection of the period, but allow you all that you need to do those incredible fights. And in this case, I decided to do all the clothes out of a single layer of transparent material, but not chiffon, not something, you know, something that would express the idea, because there's, you know, the real garments are pretty thick and have a lot of weight. And when you see them in a theatrical production, that's part of it, all those velvets and everything. And another thing that often bothers me in terms of interpreting period costume, especially these kinds of period where there's a lot to it, is the scale. The clothes somehow change the scale of the dancer in a way that's sometimes uncomfortable for me. And so what I tried to do was create the feeling and bring in the lace, but using the single layer of material that's transparent, you actually could see through a bit the costumes. And when the occasional backlight came, you could really see that you could still see the line and everything, you know, and they were extremely light, just with using all the same techniques, I think, Steve, that you use with translating your sword from something that's, you know, you need 2 hands to move and to something where they can jump. And so it was all made out of extremely, it was transparent, and it was various kinds of nylon. So you get that reflection and iridescence to keep that in mind. And then Joelle and I had to decide, well, what kind of undergarments? Because you're actually going to see those as well, or maybe you will, depending on the lighting. And so we had many layers going on and many discussions and many searches to find just the right thing. So.
And how soon do you come into the studio to see what the choreographer has created? Obviously, when you're creating something if somebody's going to be wearing something off the rack, it's not something that they have to be able to do pirouettes in. And even an actor in a theater piece doesn't have to move the way a dancer does. So there's certain things that this costume has to allow the freedom. And so how soon are you watching the choreography to make sure that your design is happening as the work is being created?
Right. I generally come in at the very beginning. I've been really lucky that Michael and many people that I've worked with invite me in at the very beginning, before the choreography started. And then I show up at the studio often throughout the period of time, because it's really important to see what the choreography is. But it's also important to always, I mean, even if they just stand there like a stone, it's important that they can move if they want to, just because the nature they're feeling. One time, an audience asked me, why do you put all those tiny little shells and beads on there? Because we can't see that. I said, no, I put them for the dancer. I think it's important that they feel like who they are, whether it's the up close or the silhouette that you get from the audience.
That's lovely. Well, this was an unusual ballet in that because our cast was so small, Michael had to have the women also be part of the cavalry. And which is why, as Steve mentioned, men and women, we all learned fencing in this ballet, which was just such great fun. Amy, I want to ask you what it was like as a dancer, because we hadn't done a lot of this before, but there was a lot of vocalizing in this ballet. And in the fight scenes, when there was the wind and the sounds of the storms, and sometimes you were running off and coming back on as the next guy that was going to die again. That's when Amy said, I think I died 7 times with Cyrano. But Amy, how was that for you? Was it fun to have an alter ego there in the ballet, and what was that like vocalizing? It's not something we do. It happens in the theater, but not often in ballet.
Became fun. It was weird at first, because it's just not second nature to a dancer, but it became our music and our signals to each other and how we coordinated things and kept a tempo and kept a pace. And we'd start at and we'd come together, and then there'd be something that would signal the stop, and that would be the timing for the next fight. And I personally found it much more fun to do in the theater than in a rehearsal studio. I remember when we were rehearsing at the old Dance Mission, and in the smaller space and yelling and screaming, and people out in the hallways are like, what the heck's going on in there? And, there's that little bit of self-consciousness that comes in when you're doing something you're not totally, is new to you. But I found it got more and more fun as the process went along, and then trying to get, deeper voice, because, we were wearing those mustaches and beards. And that's one of the things that I remember most. This is off topic, but one of the things I remember most about Cyrano, and actually whenever I hear the Mozart music playing, I can feel the sensation of ripping off a mustache and a beard and trying to get the gum off, putting on makeup, going out there as a woman, coming back, gluing it back on, ripping it off again, going out as a woman, coming back. And I remember when Michael said, I want you to bow as the dance assistant, as Cyrano's assistant. And I was like, that means I have to take it off another time just to come out in a dress. And so the glue and just how raw the faces became. But it was so important to have that full effect, and to try and find a deeper voice with the vocalizing, which became our signals to each other and our music and our rhythm for the fights. I know that Greg and Charles had some grunts and groans that were really key to like their coupe jete section with the double swords, and just some signals to each other, so that some landmark vocalization.
So those all almost became part of your music. As I was asking Steve, how do you create the fights when there is no music, and the timing? So those were clues that gave you a footprint to the fights. That's great. Well, so Sandra, you had to have smaller versions of the men's costumes for our female cavalry as well, dressed as men. And then at what point do you engage Joellen? Joellen assists you when you're out buying fabric and then scheduling a shop to create all of your costumes. Can you walk us through a little bit of that process, all the way to finally we have our dress rehearsal, and we're trying things on in the theater. And what is that process like for you?
It was in those days for sure. Joel and I worked very closely together. I mean, we did everything. I mean, I think that particular show was you, me, and Mr. Ma. And so I of course would talk to to Michael, or, you know, in the case of someone else, I start there. But it's really important, I think, to engage, you know, the people that are going to be caring for it. But Joellen and I worked even more than, well, I was going to turn it over to her, like a wardrobe department. During those years, we would work together as like a team. We'd start with the fabrics and we'd discuss everything. We'd find everything we needed. We have so many experiences finding things in odd places. And you know, it was great. It's part of the joy. And by the time it's actually turned over to her, she knows everything about it. You know, it's not like suddenly she's just getting these single layer costumes and what's she gonna do? You know, it's really, I don't know. I always thought of that as a total collaboration in terms of choices and how it would be easiest to maintain over the years.
I often wonder, and in watching this ballet again, I thought, I wonder if Joellen was happy. There was one costume change she didn't have to manage when Amy brought out the two tunics for Christian and Cyrano, and they just dressed right on stage. I thought that was one quick change Joellen didn't have to worry about. Well,
one of the most, sorry, Sal.
Go ahead,
that
Amy.
was one of the most stressful parts of the ballet for me, is making sure I had the tunics in the correct hand to hand them off on stage. I was like, don't mess this one up.
Oh my goodness. Well, I warned Joellen that I was going to talk about one of the quick costume changes that I had after the opening dream sequence when I'm in that lace dress. And then I exited in the darkness upstage. And that, I think I had about 65 seconds before I entered again in the fighting scene. And Joellen, what was that like for you? I know we practiced that so many times.
It was ultimately it was stressful. Michael used to say, I think it was 58 seconds. And Michael said, you can change the world in 58 seconds. And I said, well, she's got to completely change her clothes, you know, completely out of one outfit. And we tried, if everything went perfectly, it worked. But if there was one hiccup, then we would be late. I mean, I can remember, and then we would try different techniques. Like the dress you had to get into was a bodice and a skirt, and the bodice had hooks and eyes. Well, if it went well, it was great. A couple times it didn't. So we started to put the bodice inside the fencing jacket and just do a couple of the hooks on the bodice and get that fencing jacket zipped up. Then you had a glove as well. I mean, I can think of times you went out without the glove. Another time the jacket was zipped up and it came apart from the bottom. So you were just hooked to the top. I used to get sweaty palms knowing it was coming. And it got to the point where I had assistants with me and I couldn't do it anymore. It just stressed me out too much. So I let the assistant do it. And I guess because they didn't feel I'm sure they felt invested, but they didn't feel like the world was, you know,
the same responsibility.
Yeah, so they usually did a much better job, but I was so happy when I was like, please do this change. I can't do it.
Oh my goodness, it was a stressful time for sure. Oh my gosh. Well, Greg, I was happy to see you featuring your nose.
My nose.
That added nose. You know, I've been thinking about in times of COVID right now, when we're all getting used to dancing, our dancers are used to dancing in masks and having a hard time breathing. Maybe you have very little sympathy because you had to dance Cyrano and it was kind of just like that. Granted, your mouth was not covered. But talk about that process. It was very early on that you started to rehearse in the nose, because it was part of obviously in the first dream scene, it was part of the choreography. We had little fencing with our noses and,
Sure, yes.
And that you had to really get used to that so that you could just be completely comfortable in that, with that. What was that process like for you?
Well, early on, Michael talked to Peter Donat, the great actor from ACT who played Cyrano many times. And he talked to us, he talked to me, and he said, what you have to do is you have to practice with that nose immediately, because it changes where your eyes focus. It changes, especially with partnering with Cell, you know, where at times we should be here, but if we're partnering, the nose has to be over here. So it changes the lifts, because you can't lift close. You have to lift here. You have to put your head. So just Peter Donat, that was one of his words of wisdom, was work with the nose as much as you can and make the nose empowering. Don't be shy of it. Let it be part of your character. You know, let it be Cyrano's panache. And it really helped a lot, especially when you and I had to partner, you know, intimately, very close to each other. And I think we had to kiss at some point. So even that we had to practice. So and we didn't want the nose to, at some points, the nose is kind of soft, right? So I couldn't let it touch Cell's face, because it would bend, you know, and that would just break the illusion. And there's nothing worse than you want just to break the illusion on stage. So, and also Michael, early on, we went and got the nose done by a Hollywood, you know, makeup artist, where they put your face in, you know, clay and just a straw here, so that it would fit perfectly. And it molded perfectly to my nose. You know, once it was glued on, you could see no lines. But it was a process. I don't remember so much having a hard time breathing out of it, because I don't remember that. It was more, where is it? What do I have to avoid? And like Michael's choreography, he tells the nose is part of the story. So he never shied away from it. He made the profile quite often as a symbol of strength, you know. And yeah, I think we did do this sword fight with their nose a couple times. Yeah. It was a wonderful way of working. It had to change. It's just an added thing, like adding a sword, adding the hat. Sandra's hats were incredible with the feathers, and you know, they became part of the character. All these little things, like the way Stephen would have us, you know, you must hold the sword this way because this is the way a master would hold it. You know, all these little things help you develop a very strong character. The nose, Sandra's costume, just the way it made you, the way it hugged you and made you, you know, feel regal, and especially the hat.
Oh,
I just
yes.
remember, because the hat was one of the things we did in the very beginning. You know, don't want the hat to overpower the nose, and it was just a good balance. But I personally loved the hat, and I loved working with the sword, and I loved working with the nose after a while. It became second nature. Like
it became the character.
Yeah, it became the
well,
character, and it just helped.
You so became Cyrano, dancing that. It was such a transformation and so believable. And it was so fun to be these characters. I'm so happy you mentioned Peter Donat. He was just an incredible, to have him in the studio working with us and giving us that sage advice, and to play with the character this way, think of that and how you might deliver something. And really that brilliant trio that Michael created, where it was the partnering in lieu of poetry, since we didn't have the spoken word. Really, that trio right there is the whole ballet. It spells the whole ballet, and that beautiful partnering that you're trying to help Christian, and that you're so devoted to Roxanne that even though despite your love for her, you're willing to help her to have whatever will make her happy, even if it's not you. It's just such a heartbreaking when you have that scarf at the end, and it makes me think again about Michael Smuin and props. You know, when there are props involved, this is another thing, Steve. Hundreds of times you've got to go over and over and over. Amy and I talk about that all the time. Whether it's in the Christmas ballet when the drummer boy's got to practice his props and practice those spins, and just like Greg, you were saying with the nose. having working those props helps you to just make it become second nature, so that the same, of course, with the swords and with your costume and all of that. So that you never have to doubt where something is, it's right where you need it at a certain moment. But Amy, if KT is still on the call, I would love to bring KT in. I think KT joined us after we started Cyrano, but she was certainly there when we performed Cyrano at the Joyce in 1998. But Greg, I have to talk about that opening scene where you're just coming out of that sea of fog. And I know it's a little bit dark in the video, but what that was like for you, because I know we've had an opportunity. Now we have technology. Is KT still on the call? Or?
I am. I'm here.
Okay, Amy's going to find you. There you are. All right, KT, thank you for joining us. We're going to spotlight you so you can join our conversation, and we can talk a little bit about the technical aspects of Cyrano and those fog machines. We used to laugh because with Michael, less was never more. More was always more. And he used to love those fog machines. And in fact, KT and I were just talking the other day about the Christmas ballet, and there's certain scenes where haze is in the air and it gives a different effect with the lighting. And because of all of the new air filtration systems that are now required to be on at all times in the theater because of COVID, our haze is going to dissipate. It's going to change the effect. So, I mean, we're having to address so many issues that the audience really never finds out about. But I want to talk about Greg, because I know you had to be very careful. And I remember the fog had somewhat dissipated when I came out. And one time I was in a dress rehearsal when I went down because of the moisture. KT, can you talk about how you kept that fog low on the ground to give that effect and just to create the magic of that?
Yeah, it's a dry ice fog. And when we did Cyrano, dry ice machines, I mean, they have much smaller ones, more efficient ones now. But at that time, they were basically large garbage cans. They were about the size of your green can for yard waste. And they had a heating element in it. And you would, it had a basket, and you'd fill it with water and turn on the heating element to heat the water, and then put the dry ice in the basket. And when you needed fog, you would lower the dry ice into the hot water, and then a fan would blow it out the hose. For Cyrano, we had 4 of those. We had one in each corner of the stage to try and fill the stage. Michael, of course, wanted it, about 3 feet deep, because when the curtain went up, he didn't want to see Greg at all. He just wanted to see a sea of fog.
And he wanted to see my nose.
Yeah.
He just wanted to see my nose come up first.
Coming up out of it first, right?
Yeah, we had.
And, but, one of the challenges with dry ice too, so you mentioned slipping and the moisture. We used to sometimes refer to that as Lake Smuin, because if the temperature is just right, when the dry ice fog dissipates, you're left with a sheen of moisture on the stage, which can be quite treacherous. So we were constantly trying to fiddle with the temperature and the temperature in the theater, and to get enough fog for Greg and Michael and not create a lake on stage.
So
It was a fine balance. Go on, Greg.
We got to before we got to dress rehearsal, I think it was pre-dress rehearsal, the day before dress rehearsal, we were experimenting with the fog. And like KT said, he wanted a nice 3-foot. In order for there to be a 3-foot block of fog and the curtain open up, it's got to rush in. And you can't, so I have to lay down and hold your breath. But you hear how long the prologue is for that. It's very long. So I have to sit there and hold your breath. And in the pre-dress rehearsal, we got to that point and I held my breath as long as I possibly could. And I came up and I was a little lightheaded, and I didn't know where I didn't know where I was. I knew I was on stage, but I couldn't focus because I held my breath too long. And so he pulled it back. He said, okay, we gotta do something else. So we tried different things. If lay on your stomach, and then at the last minute, flip over, or what we finally figured out was put the hat over your head. So you could have a little like on a ship that's flipped over in the sea. You have a little pocket of air
For oxygen there.
for oxygen. And
Yeah,
that
well-
was enough to not disturb the effect. So,
Yeah, because also, I mean, dry ice is CO2,
Yeah.
so there's no oxygen in it. And,
Yeah.
and so you're down there with lying in a bank of fog that's got no oxygen in it.
yeah.
Well, and now we have different techniques. We don't use dry ice anymore. And it's a solution that is safe for the performers. And I'm not sure if you would have to do, if we had to do fog again like that, do our hazers come out thick enough to make fog now? Or we have to go back to something using dry ice? We haven't had to try that.
Yeah, the great thing about dry ice is that it's heavier than air, so it hugs the stage. And sometimes you'll see in old ballets and films, you'll see as the dry ice dissipates, it doesn't rise, it would fall into the pit because that's lower than the stage. And
I love that look. I've seen that.
yeah,
It's like a waterfall of fog into the pit.
yeah, and our machines, even though they can create dense fog, it is always lighter than air. And so the only way to create that same effect is we can use our machines, but we still have to blow it over dry ice, which we did in Pinocchio, which we can talk about later. You still blow it over dry ice, it chills the fog so that it hangs low. And you can do it without actually creating the fog with dry ice, but you still need to chill it somehow.
Okay, great. Thank you, KT. I think we can't talk about Michael and not talk about his wonderful sense of humor. And even in a ballet as serious as Cyrano, there were moments of, Michael just loved it when the audience would belt out laughing. And I think my husband had never seen me dance before. And last night we watched Cyrano. And he just laughed out loud when Christian goes and just bodily picks you up, Greg, and hauls you off into the wings and says, now it's my turn. Just silly sometimes, or when Roxanne, when I would, touch your nose in the dream scene, like, wow, that's quite a nose. But he just loved those light moments, and even in a ballet like this. And so it was so fun to see that. When we were making this ballet, we did not have the funds to have elaborate scenery. And it was incredible to see what Michael did, which is, of course, why he relied so heavily on our designers with Sandra's beautiful costumes and the magic that Stephen created with the sword fights. We just had a couple of elements. I mean, some chandeliers came down in the theater scene. We had a cross that came down in the convent scene, and then some furniture, chairs, and what have you. But it was a rather minimalist production, and yet how effective it was. But what made it so effective was Sarah Linney's lighting, and really the light became such an important element that it would create the mood. It would create rooms. It would tell the audience where to look when everybody else froze, and this is a moment where Roxanne and Christian see each other in the theater. And so it was used to help create the mood, but also to direct the audience about where we're working now. I think there was, I don't recall any of the drama that we had, for example, when Sarah Linney was lighting Carmina Burana. This one seemed a little bit more straightforward. KT, do you have, I guess you weren't there right when it was created, but later you worked with.
Yeah, I wasn't there in the spring of '97 when it was created. I joined the company in the fall of '97. But I did fly in to see the company and to meet everyone in May during your run. And I just remember Cyrano was on the program that I saw. And I remember sitting there and just absolutely enthralled by the ballet and the lighting and everything about it. The storytelling, it was magical. And then the final cue at the end, you know, the fade out that finishes right as the music ends. It was like I jumped to my feet clapping because it was so beautiful and so well done. And I mean, I had known Sarah Lenny prior to that, but you know, I think my respect for her probably rose about 50 notches that night. And because it's such a beautiful piece.
I think so too. It's been lovely to see it again. I lost track of the time. My goodness. Amy, are there any questions in the chat box that we should get to?
There are no questions in the chat box.
Okay, I guess we covered everything. Well, it has been so fun to have this look back. And I think as I was talking to Greg the other day, it makes us, again, miss Michael so much, but remember with gratitude all that he taught us. And really, Michael was about creating the magic. And Steve, I don't know if you or Sandra knew Michael, first. I think it's when did you start at San Francisco Ballet, Sandra?
Oh, I started before Michael was there. So
Okay.
right when he came, I met him.
In 73, you met him. So I thought Steve might be his longest collaborator, but I guess you take it, Sandra. But Steve is not far behind. And I know that you had a chance to work with other companies that did Michael's Romeo and Juliet when Tulsa Ballet did it and Ballet West. And it's thrilling to see. And also Ballet West will be doing it again in February. We'll be reviving Michael Smuin's full-length Romeo and Juliet. So if everyone's traveling by February, let's meet in Salt Lake and go see it. But for now, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thank you to Sandra, Stephen, Greg, and of course, KT, Joe, and Amy. It's been such a delight to have this chance to reminisce about Michael and to again thank you for all that you brought to the stage in realizing Michael's dream. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So good to see you, Greg. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.